The attorney cleared his throat. He read the list slowly. The house to Richard and Carol, the vehicles to Richard and Carol, the accounts to Richard and Carol. Then he turned the final page. The garage property at 14 Pine Street to Margaret Louise Vance. 2 seconds of silence. Then Richard laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind you make when something is so small it barely deserves a response, the kind that fills a room without meaning to, that lands on one person without ever quite aiming at her. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap. She looked at the attorney. She did not look at Richard. Carol shifted beside him, her expression arranged into something soft, the particular softness of pity which can hurt more than cruelty because it doesn't know it's hurting anyone. Richard said, "The garage. That place is barely standing." Margaret said nothing. She had been married to Harold Vance for 29 years, long enough to know that he never kept useless things, not tools, not receipts, not old keys, not promises, and certainly not a garage. What Richard did not know, what none of them knew, was that Harold had been planning long before that room, that laugh, that Tuesday afternoon light on Daniel Park's conference table, long before Richard started counting what he thought he had won. He didn't leave Margaret a garage. He left her the land beneath it. And the difference between those two things, between what a man appears to leave and what he actually leaves, was the whole story. 3 days later, Margaret stood alone inside the old garage on Pine Street. Dust on the floor, cold light through the cracked side window, the smell of oil and old timber, and the particular stillness of a place that has been someone's private space for a long time and knows how to hold its quiet. On the bottom shelf, exactly where Harold had always kept it, sat his old red Craftsman toolbox. Padlocked? Margaret reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers found the small key Daniel Park had handed her, after the reading separate from the others on its own ring, set aside with the particular deliberateness of a man who understood that certain things needed to be given carefully and received clearly. She had not known what it opened. She was about to find out. The morning after Harold's funeral, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and did not drink her coffee. She had made it from habit, the same way she had made it every morning for 29 years, the same number of scoops, the same 2 mugs taken down from the cabinet before she was fully awake, before her hands had remembered that there was only one person left to pour for. She had stood at the counter with both mugs and then set one back and carried the other to the table and sat down and let the coffee go cold while the October light came through the window at its low, honest angle. Harold's reading glasses were on the table. She had not moved them. They sat folded on the newspaper from 2 days ago, the last one he had read still creased to the crossword, half the squares filled in his careful pencil. She had looked at the unfinished puzzle once and then looked away. She was not ready for that yet. His coffee mug was still on the counter, the dark blue one, the one with the small chip on the base that he had never mentioned and never replaced because Harold did not discard things that still worked. That was him entirely. Nothing wasted, nothing performed, everything kept until it had given what it had to give. From the living room came the low, efficient sound of Richard's voice. He had arrived the evening before the funeral, he and Carol both driving up together, filling the guest rooms with their luggage and their careful condolences. They had been attentive at the service. They had stood beside her at the graveside and shaken hands with neighbors and said the right things in the right order. And then they had come back to the house, and Richard had made 2 phone calls before dinner, and Carol had walked through the room slowly, in the way of someone taking inventory rather than paying respects, touching the edge of the sideboard, pausing at the bookshelf, her eyes moving in the particular way of a person assessing rather than remembering. Margaret had watched. She had always been good at watching. She had met Harold's children at the beginning of their marriage, Richard 23. At the time, Carol 20, both of them old enough to have formed their opinions about their father's second wife before she had any chance to form a different impression. They had been civil. They had remained civil for 29 years. Civil was the word. Not warm, not close, not the complicated thing that step-families sometimes became with enough time and goodwill. Just civil, a surface that held without revealing anything beneath it. She wrapped her hands around her cold coffee cup and listened to Richard's voice in the next room, the words indistinct, the tone businesslike. Harold came to her in fragments the way he always came now, not as a whole person, but in pieces, the specific sensory memories that grief sends up without warning. The sound of the back door opening on Sunday mornings, the particular way he cleared his throat before he said something he had been thinking about for a while, the smell of motor oil and sawdust that came off his hands after an afternoon in the garage, the way he would hold them up in mock surrender when he came inside saying he'd wash before he touched anything. The garage on Pine Street. He had owned it before they met a separate property, a small commercial building he had used as a workshop in the early years of his carpentry business, then gradually as storage, then as what he called his thinking place. She had been inside it perhaps a dozen times in their marriage. It was his space, the way certain spaces belong to certain people, without requiring explanation. She had understood that without discussion. The best thinking happens with a wrench in hand, Maggie. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He had said it coming through the back door one Sunday afternoon, oil on his hands, that particular expression of a man who has resolved something he had been working on. She had laughed at him. She had handed him the dish soap. She had not known then or since what he thought about in that garage. She was beginning to wonder. On the second afternoon, Margaret was in the kitchen when Richard came to stand at the back window. He was not looking at the yard. She understood this the way she understood quiet things by the quality of his attention, the slight forward lean, the angle of his eyes past the fence line in the direction of the street beyond. He stood there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he turned back to the room and picked up his phone and left. She did not say anything. She filed it away the way she filed things that she did not yet understand but recognized as worth keeping, the way Harold filed receipts and survey documents and small pieces of paper that seemed minor until they weren't. She didn't know then what she would learn later, but Margaret had always been better at watching than people gave her credit for. The days between the funeral and Thursday had a quality she recognized from difficult times before, the slow, underwater quality of days that must be lived through, rather than lived, each one requiring a specific effort to complete. She answered the phone. She accepted the casseroles. She wrote the thank you notes in the careful handwriting Harold had always admired, that she had learned from her mother and kept all her life. Richard and Carol left on Wednesday morning. They said they would see her at the attorney's office the next day. Richard gave her a brief, efficient hug. Carol held her hands and looked at her with the soft, careful expression she had been wearing all week, the expression of a woman who feels sorry for someone she doesn't quite believe in. The house was quiet after they left. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She rose at 2 in the morning and went to the kitchen for water and stood at the counter in the dark. And it was in reaching for the light switch that she saw it, the notepad on the refrigerator, the one Harold had kept there for 30 years, for grocery lists and reminders, the pages covered in the accumulated record of ordinary domestic life. She looked at it without meaning to look at it specifically. And she saw his handwriting, not old recent. The ink still clear, the letters in his particular block print, the kind he used when something needed to be remembered rather than merely noted. Don't forget Pine Street M. She stood very still. She did not know what it meant. She did not know when he had written it, though the ink looked recent weeks, maybe. She did not know if the M meant her or something else, though Harold had called her Maggie, had written her initial on notes to her for 29 years, and there was no other M she could think of. She tore the page from the notepad carefully along the perforated edge. She held it under the kitchen light for a moment, his handwriting those 7 words, whatever they meant. Then she folded it once and put it in the pocket of her robe next to her heart, the way you keep things that don't yet make sense but feel like they matter. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. In the morning she dressed carefully, the good gray wool, the pearl earrings Harold had given her on their 20th anniversary. She made 1 cup of coffee. She stood at the counter for a moment and looked at his blue mug, and did not move it. Then she put on her coat and transferred the folded notepad page from her robe to the coat's inner pocket, and she picked up her keys and she got in the car. She did not tell Richard about the note. She drove to Daniel Park's office in the early October morning, the note folded against her chest, carrying something she did not yet understand toward a room that was about to tell her more than she expected, though not she would later understand everything. Not yet. Harold always said the garage was his thinking place. That was where he worked things out. She was beginning to understand that he had worked out quite a lot. Daniel Park's conference room had the particular quality of rooms where serious things happen without theater. No artwork chosen to impress, no furniture that announced itself, just a long table, and gray morning light through the windows, and the smell of old paper, and the kind of quiet that rooms accumulate when they have held difficult conversations for many years. Margaret arrived first. She had driven across town in the early October morning with the notepad page in her coat pocket, and Harold's coffee mug left on the counter at home because she still was not ready to move it, and she had parked and sat in the car for a moment before going in, not from hesitation but from the habit of a woman who had learned to take a full breath before entering rooms that required her to be steady. She sat on one side of the table. The chair felt deliberate in its aloneness, the way chairs feel when you are the only person on your side of something. Richard and Carol arrived together 7 minutes later. Richard in a dark jacket, a folder under his arm, the folder of a man who is prepared for a meeting rather than simply attending one. Carol in a coat Margaret had not seen before, her expression arranged into the careful softness she had been wearing all week. They sat across the table, and Richard set his folder in front of him, and Carol folded her hands, and the room held the three of them in its gray morning light. Daniel Park came in precisely at 10. He was a compact, measured man who moved through difficult rooms with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this work for 30 years and has stopped confusing speed with competence. He had reading glasses and a manila folder and the quiet authority of a person who understands that the most important thing he can do in a room like this is read clearly and let the document say what it says. He sat. He opened the folder. He read, "The house at Birchwood Road to Richard and Carol Vance, jointly in equal portions. The vehicles, the sedan and the truck, to Richard and Carol Vance, to be distributed at their discretion. The joint checking and savings accounts after settlement of debts and estate costs to Richard and Carol Vance in equal portions. The contents of the workshop at Birchwood Road, excluding items specified below, to Richard and Carol Vance." Richard's posture across the table had the quality of a man confirming something he already knew. Carol's hands remained folded. The room was very quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when people are listening to something being read aloud that they have already worked out in advance. Daniel Park turned to the final page. He said the garage property at 14 Pine Street, sole and separate ownership, to Margaret Louise Vance. 2 seconds. Then Richard made a sound that was not quite a word. A short exhale with a shape to it, the kind of sound that precedes a comment that has already decided it doesn't need to be a full sentence. He said, "Well, that's very Harold." He said it the way you say something when you are performing restraint, the tone that says, "I could say more, but I am choosing not to," and the choosing is itself a statement. He leaned back slightly in his chair. He did not look at Margaret when he said it. Carol looked at Margaret with her carefully softened expression. She said, "At least you have the memories of it, Margaret." "I know how much Harold loved that old place." Margaret said nothing. She sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at Daniel Park and let the silence be what it was, not empty, not wounded, just present. She had learned in 29 years beside a quiet man that silence was not a deficit, that the absence of a response was sometimes its own kind of answer. She signed where Daniel Park indicated. She signed clearly without hurry in the good handwriting Harold had always admired. "Hey!" While Carol was gathering her coat and Richard was making a note in his folder, Margaret heard him address Daniel Park in the low, efficient tone he used when he wanted to sound casual about something he had planned to ask. He said, "Is there a full property record on the Pine Street parcel for estate accounting purposes?" Daniel Park said, without looking up from his papers, "I'd recommend requesting that from the county recorder, Mr. Vance." Richard nodded. He made another note. He moved on. Margaret was watching. She had been watching Richard for 29 years in the way that people watch things they do not fully trust, not with suspicion exactly, but with the specific attention of someone who has learned that the details matter and has stopped assuming they don't. She watched him write the note and close his folder and stand up from the table, and she filed what she had seen the way Harold had taught her to file things not in a drawer, but in the part of the mind that holds things until they are needed. In the parking lot, Margaret stopped. She opened the envelope Daniel Park's assistant had handed her on the way out, a plain envelope, her name typed on the front, the contents described on the outside, in a brief handwritten note in Daniel's handwriting, key and address, Pine Street. She opened it and reached inside. The key was small, older than she expected, the brass worn smooth at the bow, the teeth slightly darkened with age, the kind of key that had been kept somewhere specific and handled regularly by someone who knew what it opened and intended to keep on knowing. Harold had kept this key somewhere all this time. She held it in her palm in the gray October morning and looked at it and thought about Harold coming through the back door on Sunday afternoons with oil on his hands, and about his voice in the car early in their marriage driving past a corner lot on Pine Street. She had forgotten that until now. The specific quality of the memory returning, Harold driving his eyes on the road. That particular tone he used when he was saying something he meant more than he was showing. That land is going to matter one day, Maggie. Just remember I told you. She had smiled. She had not asked more. She had trusted the sentence the way she trusted most of what Harold said as complete, even when it was brief. She got in the car. She placed the key on the passenger seat. She took the notepad page from her coat pocket and placed it beside the address card Daniel Park had included in the envelope. She looked at them side by side. Harold's handwriting on the notepad. Don't forget Pine Street, M. The typed address on the card, 14 Pine Street. The same. He had written the note knowing she would need it. He had written it at some point in the weeks before he died. She did not know when, could not know when, and left it on the refrigerator notepad where she would find it, where she had found 1,000 ordinary reminders over 29 years of breakfasts and mornings and the accumulated life of a shared kitchen. He had left it like a reminder to pick up milk. He had left it like a map. She started the car. She did not feel devastated. She had expected to feel devastated, had braced for the room, for the formal reading of everything being distributed to other people, for the specific ache of hearing your name attached to the smallest item on the list. She had expected Richard's laugh to undo her. It had not. What she felt instead was quieter than grief and more alert than comfort. It was the feeling she associated with Harold on his Sunday afternoons, the feeling of something being worked out of pieces that had not yet found their arrangement beginning to move toward one. She thought he kept this key somewhere all this time. She thought he wrote the note on the refrigerator for me to find. She thought Harold never kept useless things. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward Pine Street, the key and the notepad page and the address card on the seat beside her, the October morning cold and clear around her, moving toward the garage that Richard had laughed at, and Carol had pitied, and Harold had left her on purpose for reasons she was just beginning to understand she needed to find out. The garage on Pine Street did not look like much. It sat at the end of a short gravel apron off the county road, a single-bay structure, gray wood siding that had weathered past the point of color, a low roof line, one window on the side wall, with the glass still intact, but clouded from years of road dust. The lot around it had gone to grass at the edges, the kind of slow encroachment that happens to places that are maintained without being occupied, kept but not lived in the distinction visible if you knew how to look. Margaret stood at the door with the key in her hand and looked at it for a moment. She had driven past this building 100 times over 29 years without stopping. She had known it existed the way you know the coordinates of a place that belongs to someone you trust, approximately without needing the details. Harold's garage, his thinking place, the place he went on Saturday mornings sometimes, and came home from with the particular settled quality of a man who had worked something out. She put the key in the padlock. It turned on the first try. She pushed the door open and stood in the threshold while her eyes adjusted to the interior light. It smelled like Harold. Not his particular personal smell, not the aftershave or the wool of his good sweater. The other Harold, the one that existed when no one was watching, motor oil and sawdust, and the dry wooden smell of a workbench that has been used for serious purposes over a long time. the smell of a man at work distilled and preserved in the walls and the concrete floor and the air that had been closed in here since the last time he came. She stepped inside. The organization was immediately, unmistakably his. Harold had a specific relationship with tools, not sentimental, not casual, but exacting. Every tool in its place, every place clearly assigned. The pegboard along the back wall held his hand tools in the outlined arrangement she recognized from the workshop at home, each tool's silhouette traced in marker, so he always knew at a glance what was present and what was missing. The shelves along the left wall held his oil cans in size, order his fastener jars labeled in his block print, his electrical tape and wire and sandpaper organized by grade in the way of a man who had decided decades ago that disorder was a form of disrespect toward the work. She moved through it slowly, not looking for anything specific, just moving through it the way you move through a place where someone you loved spent time alone with the particular reverence of encountering a private version of a person you thought you knew completely. A pair of work gloves on the second shelf worn at the thumb and forefinger. She touched them without picking them up. His fishing hat on a nail by the door, the brim shaped by years of his particular way of pulling it down. A coffee thermos on the top shelf, the old green one she had thought was lost that he had apparently relocated here years ago without mentioning it. She stopped at the workbench. She ran her hand along the surface. It was clean. Not dusty clean, not the grime of a neglected space. Clean in the specific way of a surface that has been regularly wiped down, maintained, kept ready. The wood was smooth under her palm, the kind of smooth that comes from decades of use and care combined. He had not just stored things here. He had come here to prepare. She stood at the workbench for a moment and understood something she had not understood before, that this garage had not been a retreat from his life. It had been a room where he worked on it, where he thought about it and planned for it and kept the things that needed keeping. She turned to the bottom shelf. The Craftsman toolbox sat where it had always sat in Harold's photographs and Harold's stories, and the occasional reference over 29 years that she had filed away without examining. Red steel construction, the kind made in the era when tools were built to outlast the people who bought them. It was heavier than it looked, she could tell from the way it sat on the shelf, the settled immovability of something dense. The padlock through the latch was small brass, the same style as the one on the door. She looked at it. Then she looked at her keyring. She had carried this keyring for 11 years, the same ring Harold had handed her one evening in the kitchen, saying he had reorganized her keys and added a spare for the car. She had not counted what was on it at the time. She had simply taken it and added it to her bag and carried it without inventory in the way of a person who trusts the person who gave her something to have given her something right. There was a small brass key on the ring. She had always assumed it was a spare for something at the house, some lock she had never needed to use, the kind of key that accumulates on key rings over the years without requiring explanation. She put it in the padlock. It turned. She stood for a moment with the open padlock in her hand and thought about Harold handing her the key ring 11 years ago. She thought about what it meant that he had put this key on her ring 11 years ago without explaining it. She thought about the notepad on the refrigerator and the note on the address card, and the way Harold had arranged things patiently over years in the sequence that made sense rather than the sequence that was most convenient to explain. She lifted the toolbox lid. The tools were Harold's, his socket set in the tray, his pliers and screwdrivers in their designated spaces, the organized interior of a man who believed that the arrangement of tools was a form of respect for what they could do. She recognized each one, or recognized the type the way you recognize the handwriting of someone before you read what they've written. And on top of the tools placed deliberately where it would be the first thing visible when the lid was lifted was an envelope. Cream-colored, slightly aged at the edges in the way of paper that has been stored carefully for some time. Her name on the front in Harold's handwriting, not his quick everyday print, but his deliberate writing, the kind he used when something needed to last. Margaret Louise. She carried the envelope to the workbench stool, the low three-legged stool that had lived in every workshop Harold had ever kept, and she sat down and held it for a moment before she opened it. The garage was very quiet. The afternoon light through the side window had gone low, and amber, the particular light of October, late in the day, the kind Harold had always called the working light, the light that showed you what things actually were. She opened the envelope. Inside 3 items. A formal document folded in thirds, the kind of paper that carries official weight, thick with a notary seal visible at the bottom edge. A survey map folded smaller, the kind produced by a licensed surveyor, dense with boundary notations and measurements. And beneath both of these, a single piece of lined paper, folded once the kind torn from a legal pad, Harold's everyday writing paper for things that were not formal, but were important. She took out the lined paper first. 1 sentence. His handwriting unhurried. The letters formed the way he formed them when he was saying something he had been thinking about for a long time and had finally found the plainest way to say, "This has always been yours, Maggie. I just made sure the paper agreed." She read it once. Then she sat very still. She did not cry. The feeling that moved through her was not the kind that produces tears. It was larger than that and quieter, the feeling of something that has been true for a long time, becoming visible. Like a boundary line appearing on a map that had always been there, waiting for someone to draw it in. She sat on Harold's workshop stool in Harold's garage in the October working light and held 1 sentence in her hands and felt for the first time since the morning after the funeral something that was not grief. She did not know yet what the document said. She did not know yet what the survey map described. She did not know the number that would eventually appear on Daniel Park's desk, or what Richard had already done at the county recorder's office, or what the boundary line on the survey extended to. She knew 1 sentence. It was enough for this moment to be the ground beneath everything else. She folded the lined paper carefully. She placed everything back in the envelope. She held it against her chest for a moment, the way you hold something that has just changed the shape of things. Then she took out her phone and called Ruth. She said, "I need you to come over tonight. Harold left me something. I don't understand it yet, but I think it's important." Outside, the October light continued its slow work on the garage walls, on the gravel apron on the county road beyond the same road that ran past this building, that fronted this lot, that had been running past this piece of land for longer than anyone had been paying attention to what the land was worth. Harold had been paying attention. He had been paying attention for a very long time. Daniel Park's office in the morning had the quality of a room that had held difficult truths for a long time and had learned to do so without drama. The same wood-paneled walls, the same crowded bookshelves, the same window with its view of the courtyard oak, now in its full October color. Margaret had sat across this desk 3 days ago and heard Harold's estate divided into a list. She sat across it again now, and Ruth sat beside her, and the envelope from the Craftsman toolbox was open on the desk between them. Park put on his reading glasses. He picked up the deed first. He read it the way he read everything completely without skimming his attention, moving line by line with the unhurried precision of a man who has learned that the details of a document are not obstacles to understanding, but the understanding itself. Margaret watched his posture as he read. She had become in the past 3 days a student of small signals, the way a person's body tells you what their face is managing not to. His posture shifted, not dramatically. A slight forward lean, the kind of adjustment a person makes when something has caught their full attention and they want to be closer to it. He set the deed down and picked up the survey map and unfolded it carefully on the desk, smoothing the creases with his palm, orienting it to the window light. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Vance, where did you find these?" Margaret said, "In Harold's toolbox, in the garage." Park nodded once, as if confirming something he had been considering. He said, "I need to explain what you have here. I'd like to take it in order, if that's all right." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. Ruth sat beside her with the still attentiveness of a woman who has come to be present for something and intends to be fully present. Park said the deed. He turned it to face them across the desk and placed his finger at the top of the first paragraph. He said, "This is a property deed for the land parcel at 14 Pine Street. It was registered with the county recorder 14 years ago. The registered owner, the sole registered owner, is Margaret Louise Vance." He paused to let that land. Not Harold Vance, not Harold and Margaret Vance jointly, Margaret Louise Vance, alone, specifically. He said this parcel was never part of Harold's estate because it was never Harold's property to include. He transferred it to your name 14 years ago. From that date forward, legally and completely, it has been yours. It passes to no one through Harold's will because it was not Harold's to will. It sits entirely outside of the probate process. Ruth said quietly, Margaret. Margaret said nothing. She looked at the deed at her name in the formal type of a legal document at the notary seal at the bottom, at the date 14 years ago that she had known nothing about. Park picked up the survey map. He said, now look at this. He turned the map and traced the boundary line with his finger. The shaded line Margaret had followed with her own finger in the garage, the line that extended further than she had expected. He traced it from the garage structure outward past the lot line she would have assumed continuing to the edge of the map, where a bold notation marked the county road. He said the parcel fronts the county road corridor. That's the boundary here, this line. The garage is on the parcel, but the parcel is considerably larger than the garage. 14 years ago, when Harold registered this, the county road was a secondary route. In the past 5 years, it has become a primary commercial corridor. There has been significant developer interest in this stretch for the past 3 years. He set the map down. He said the land beneath that garage fronts the county road, Mrs. Vance. It's commercially zoned. There are developers who have been watching this corridor for 3 years. Your husband understood exactly what he was giving you. The room was very quiet. Margaret thought about Harold driving her past the Pine Street corner at dusk years ago. She had placed the memory when she was sitting in the garage on the workbench stool, holding his one sentence on the lined paper, but it was coming back to her more fully now. The particular quality of his voice. That corridor is going to matter, Maggie. Keep your eye on it. She had kept her eye on it without knowing what she was watching. She had trusted the instruction the way she trusted all of his instructions as complete, even when brief. Ruth said, "What is it worth?" Park said a formal appraisal would give you a precise number. Based on comparable commercial parcels in this corridor that have sold or been under offer in the past 18 months, I would estimate the range at $320,000 to $380,000. Possibly more depending on how motivated a buyer is and how the corridor develops. Ruth's hand came to rest on Margaret's arm. Margaret looked at the survey map spread on the desk between them. At the boundary lines Harold had understood 14 years ago, at her name on the deed beside it. She thought about the key on her keyring, the small brass key she had carried for years without knowing what it opened. She said, "Ruth, how long ago did Harold put that key on my key ring?" Ruth looked at her. Margaret said the key to the toolbox. He put it on my ring himself and told me to keep it with me. I never asked why. She looked at the date on the deed. She said 11 years ago. I thought it was 11. She counted backward from the deed's date. 14 years ago, the parcel was registered. 3 years later, 11 years ago, Harold had placed the key on her key ring. He had registered the parcel first. Then 3 years later, when the paperwork was settled and clean and fully recorded, he had given her the key. He had built the foundation first, then given her the way in. Park was watching her. He had the expression of a man who has delivered difficult information many times and has learned to give people the time they need to receive it. He said, "There's one more thing." He opened a separate folder. Not the one from the envelope, but one from his own files, the kind that had been retrieved and prepared before this meeting. He placed a single document on the desk. It was a county property inquiry form, the kind filed by a member of the public requesting information about a specific parcel, its registration, its ownership, its zoning status, standard procedure available to anyone. Park said 6 months before Harold passed this inquiry was filed with the county recorder's office for the Pine Street parcel. He turned the document to face them. At the top in the field marked Inquiring Party, a name was typed in the plain font of a county form. Richard Vance. The room was very still. Ruth's hand tightened slightly on Margaret's arm. Not dramatically, just a small present pressure. The pressure of a woman who is sitting beside someone receiving something large and wants them to know she is there. Margaret looked at Richard's name on the form. She looked at the date, 6 months before Harold died. She thought about the will reading, the conference table, the gray morning, the attorney's voice reading the list. She thought about Richard's short laugh, the laugh she had heard as dismissal, as contempt, as the casual diminishment of a man who had decided her inheritance was too small to take seriously. She thought about the folder he had carried to the will reading, the way he had asked Daniel Park about the property record casually as if it were a minor accounting detail. He had not been dismissing her. He had been watching. He had filed the inquiry 6 months before Harold died. He had found the parcel registered in her name. He had understood what it was worth and what it meant. He had walked into that will reading knowing. The laugh had not been contempt. It had been strategy. She was not angry. She noticed this about herself with the same quiet attention she had been bringing to everything in the past 3 days. The absence of anger, the presence instead of something colder and clearer. The feeling of a picture coming into focus, of pieces that had been moving toward an arrangement finally finding it. Harold knew Richard would look. Harold had registered the parcel before Richard had any reason to check. He had built the protection 14 years ago when there was nothing yet to protect against, because Harold thought the way he built, which was for the weight that hadn't arrived yet, the stress that hadn't been applied, the future he could see the shape of even when it was still distant. Park set down the inquiry document. He said, "Mrs. Vance, your husband registered this parcel in your name specifically so it could never be touched. He did it on purpose, all of it." Margaret looked at the deed and the survey map and Richard's name on the county form and Harold's one sentence on the lined paper still in her coat pocket. "This has always been yours, Maggie. I just made sure the paper agreed." She had not known when she read it in the garage how long he had been making sure. She knew now. 14 years. He had been making sure for 14 years quietly without announcement in the specific way he did everything that mattered, building the thing before anyone knew it needed to be built. She said, "What do I do first?" Daniel Park picked up his pen. The estate access period gave Margaret 30 days in the house on Birchwood Road. She had not asked for more. She had asked for what she needed time to go through Harold's books, his personal papers, the accumulated documentation of a life that had been methodical in its organization and would require methodical work to sort. She had been given the 30 days by Richard's attorney in the language of a concession, as if the house were already fully Richard's and the access a courtesy he was extending. She had accepted it the same way quietly, without comment, filing the distinction between his assumption and the legal reality in the part of her mind where she had been filing things since the morning of the will reading. She was on the 3rd shelf of Harold's study when her phone rang. Richard's name on the screen. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set down the book she was holding, a carpenter's reference manual from the 1980s, Harold's handwriting in the margins, and answered. He opened warmly. That was the word for it, warm in the way that has been prepared rather than felt the warmth of a man who has decided on a tone and is executing it. He said, "Margaret, just wanted to make sure you're doing okay. It's a hard time." She said, "I'm managing Richard. Thank you." He said, "Good. That's good." He paused, the pause of a man moving from the opening to the substance. He said, "I heard you'd been in to see an attorney about the Pine Street property." She said, "I've been handling some things, yes." He said, Right, I understand. It's a lot to deal with." He said it with the particular texture of a man establishing context before making an offer. "Listen, I've been thinking. That property is going to be a burden for you. The upkeep, the taxes, the maintenance. You don't need that on top of everything else." A pause. He said, "I'd be willing to take it off your hands, make it simple for everyone. I could offer $45,000 fair value for the structure and the lot given the condition. You wouldn't have to deal with any of it." Margaret said, "I'll think about it." The words were true. She would think about it. She was thinking about it already, about the number, about the gap between $45,000 and the range Daniel Park had given her, about the specific size of the gap and what it told her about what Richard knew and was hoping she didn't. She heard Harold's voice from some evening years ago, said once, not repeated in the way he said things he meant as permanent. "My son sees value in things, Maggie. That's his nature, just know the difference between what he values and what matters. She had always known the difference. She had simply never had occasion to use the knowledge in quite this way. Richard's tone changed. Not dramatically a modulation, a slight cooling of the warmth, the way a room changes temperature when a door has been opened somewhere. He said, I just want to make sure everything is handled properly. Dad was in those last months, Margaret. He wasn't always... He paused. I'm not sure he always had the clearest picture of things, of what made sense. Financially, she heard what was beneath it, not a concern about Harold's clarity, a signal, the kind of signal that says I have a position available to me if I need it, and I want you to know I have it, and I hope knowing that is enough. She said Harold was very clear about what he wanted Richard. He always was. He said, I'm sure. I just think for everyone's sake, keeping things in the family, Dad always wanted that. I'm sure you understand. She said, I understand exactly what Harold wanted Richard. Thank you for calling. She ended the call. She stood for a moment in Harold's study with the phone in her hand. Through the window she could see the backyard, the oak Harold had planted 20 years ago, the garden bed along the south fence, the ordinary evidence of a life lived carefully in a place he had loved. She looked at it without thinking about it specifically, in the way you look at things when you are actually thinking about something else. She reached into her coat pocket, the notepad page. Don't forget Pine Street M was still there folded once where she had carried it since the night she found it. She took it out and looked at it. Harold's handwriting, 7 words. The torn edge where she had pulled it from the refrigerator notepad at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. He had written it for her to find. He had put the key on her key ring. He had registered the parcel 14 years ago and filed the independent notarized affidavit and left the envelope in the toolbox and written 1 sentence on a piece of lined paper. He had done all of it quietly over years without announcement, without requiring her to know what he was building until the building was complete and the moment had arrived that required it. She refolded the note carefully along its original crease and put it back in her pocket. She did not call Ruth. Not yet. She picked up the carpenter's manual from the shelf where she had set it down and continued sorting. She called Daniel Park from the car. She told him what Richard had said, the offer, the number, the comment about Harold's clarity in the final months. She reported it plainly in order without editorializing the way she had learned to deliver information that needed to be received accurately. Park listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said the parcel cannot be contested through normal probate channels. It was never in Harold's estate, and the registration predates any plausible claim by 14 years. What Richard could do if he chose to is file a challenge to the separate registration itself. The legal basis would be undue influence, the argument that Harold was improperly influenced in transferring the parcel to your name. Margaret said, can that succeed? Park said it is a weak claim. Harold registered this parcel 14 years ago in full health with a notarized affidavit of independent intent that he filed at the same time. He prepared specifically for a challenge of this type. The documentation is strong. He paused. He said, but a weak claim still requires a response. It would take time and cost money to defend. Richard may be counting on that. Margaret said, I see. She drove the rest of the way home without speaking through the October streets, past the corner where Pine Street met the county road, past the gray garage with its low roof line and its 1 clouded window, and its commercially zoned land beneath it that Harold had registered in her name before any of this had been necessary. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday morning. She saw it through the door glass before she opened it. The green card, the return address of an attorney's office. She didn't recognize the official shape of something that had been sent with the intent to be received formally. She signed for it. She thanked the carrier. She closed the door. She set the letter on the kitchen table. Then she made coffee, 1 cup, the same number of scoops, the same timing, and she stood at the counter for a moment and looked at Harold's blue mug, which was still on the counter where it had been since the morning after the funeral, which she had still not moved, which she was perhaps not going to move for a while yet. Then she carried her cup to the table and sat down. She opened the envelope. Richard's attorney had filed a challenge to the registration of the Pine Street parcel on the basis of undue influence. The language was formal and specific and designed to look more substantial than Daniel Park had suggested it was. She read it twice, the way she read everything that mattered completely without skipping, letting each sentence say what it said before moving to the next. When she finished, she folded it along its crease and set it beside her coffee cup. She picked up her phone and called Daniel Park. He answered on the second ring. He said it arrived. She said this morning. He said, "Mrs. Vance, I want to be straightforward with you. This is a weak claim against a strong record. Harold prepared for this specifically, but defending it will take time, and Richard's attorney will make it take as much time as possible. Are you willing to fight it?" Margaret looked at the letter on the table beside her coffee cup. She looked at the kitchen around her, Harold's kitchen, the kitchen where he had made coffee every morning for 29 years and left notes on the refrigerator notepad, and placed a key on her keyring one evening without explaining why, because he had known she would carry it without needing the explanation. She said yes. She said it without hesitation, without qualification, in the same even register she had been using since the morning after the funeral. The voice of a woman who has decided something and means it. Park said, "Good, then let's begin." Daniel Park called on a Monday morning. His voice had the quality she had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks, the measured delivery of a man who has found something and is being careful about how he presents it, giving the information its proper shape before he offers it. He said, "I'd like you to come in, Mrs. Vance, this afternoon if you're able. There's been a development." She said, "I'll be there at 2. She did not ask what the development was. She had learned in the weeks since the will reading to let things arrive in their own order, rather than reaching ahead for them. Harold had built in that direction, each layer revealing itself when it was needed, each piece in its right sequence. She had begun without deciding to move through this the way he had built it. Park was at his desk when she arrived. The deed envelope was open in front of him, the survey map unfolded to one side. He had his reading glasses on, which he wore when he was working, rather than when he was speaking, and this told her he had been reviewing the documents again before she came in. He said, "When we first reviewed the envelope, the deed and the survey map were the primary documents. They were what the situation required at the time, and we focused on them correctly." He reached into the envelope and withdrew a smaller piece of paper, folded separately, tucked against the inner seam of the envelope in a way that would be easy to miss if you were looking for something else easy to overlook in the initial review. He said this was inside, folded smaller, placed separately. "I found it this morning when I was going back through everything in preparation for responding to Richard's attorney." He unfolded it on the desk and turned it to face her. It was a single page, official in format, the particular formality of a legal affidavit, with the structured language of a document that has been drafted by an attorney and signed before a notary. At the top, the title in plain type, Affidavit of Independent Registration. At the bottom, Harold's signature clear and deliberate above the notary's seal and the date. 14 years ago, the same date as the deed. Margaret looked at it without speaking. Park said, "This is an affidavit of independent registration. It was filed at the same time as the deed, same date, same county recorder's office. It states explicitly that the registration of the Pine Street parcel in your name was made freely with full understanding of its legal implications, without duress and without undue influence of any kind." He paused. He said it also states that Harold retained independent legal counsel for this specific transaction, an attorney unconnected to any other aspect of his legal or financial affairs. Margaret said, "Who?" Park turned the affidavit and indicated a name in the document's preamble. An attorney in a county 2 hours north, a name she had never heard Harold mention, a name she did not recognize from any document or conversation in 29 years of marriage. Park said, "I've checked. This attorney has no connection to Harold's regular legal affairs, no connection to the family estate, no connection to anyone in Richard's circle. Harold used him once for this specific document, and never again." He set the affidavit down carefully. He said, "Your husband chose an attorney. Richard had never heard of someone entirely outside the family's circle. That wasn't oversight, Mrs. Vance. That was architecture." The room was quiet. Margaret thought about Harold watching the evening news once years ago with the particular half attention he gave the television when he was actually thinking about something else. She had asked him what he was thinking about. He had said, without turning from the screen, "The best protection you can give someone isn't money, Maggie. It's documentation, paper with a seal on it. That's what stands up when people push." She had thought he was talking about something in the news. She had thought about it occasionally, since in the way you think about things that were said plainly and might mean more than they seemed. She understood now that he had been talking about this, about a specific piece of paper with a specific seal filed in a specific county recorder's office by a specific attorney no one would recognize on a specific date 14 years ago. He had been thinking about this for 14 years. Park said the undue influence claim is legally dead on arrival, Mrs. Vance. This affidavit was prepared specifically to preempt it. Harold understood that someone might argue after his death that he had been improperly influenced in making this registration. He prepared a document at the time of the registration with independent counsel that makes that argument legally untenable. He said your husband sealed it. Margaret looked at Harold's signature on the affidavit. The same handwriting as the note on the lined paper. "This has always been yours, Maggie." The same handwriting as the refrigerator notepad. "Don't forget Pine Street." The same hand building the same thing expressed in different forms across 14 years. She could trace the consistency of it the way you trace the grain of wood, the same material beneath every surface, the same fundamental structure running through everything he made. She said, "File it." Park said, "I already have the paperwork prepared. I'll submit it to the county recorder this afternoon and send copies to Richard's attorney simultaneously. He said I expect his attorney will request time to review. That's standard. It will not change the outcome." 2 days later, Park called to confirm the submission. That evening, Margaret drove to Pine Street alone. The October rain had arrived by the time she parked in front of the garage, not heavy, just the steady, persistent rain of a gray evening, the kind that made the county road gleam and darkened the wood siding of the garage to the color of old iron. She unlocked the door and went in. She turned on the single overhead light. She went to the workbench. She stood at it with her hands flat on the surface, the same clean, maintained surface she had run her hand along the first time she came in, the surface that had told her Harold was not storing things here, but preparing them. She understood it more fully now. She understood the whole room more fully, the pegboard with its outlined tools, the labeled jars, the organized shelves. It was not the workshop of a man who used this space to escape. It was the workshop of a man who used it to think, and what he had been thinking about for a very long time was this. He had built a room that would hold. He had kept it that way, clean, maintained, ready, because he had known that the room's steadiness was part of the plan, that she would come here after he was gone and she would need the room to be what it had always been. She stood at the workbench in the rain sound and thought about 14 years of quiet preparation, about an attorney 2 counties north who had been used once and never again, about a notary seal on a piece of paper that had been folded and tucked into the inner seam of an envelope and left in a padlocked toolbox in a maintained garage on a commercially zoned lot on a county road that was going to matter. Harold had said that. The corridor was going to matter. He had known the shape of the future before the future had confirmed it. She stayed until the rain stopped. When she left, she did not lock the garage door. She stood for a moment with the padlock in her hand, looking at the door, and then she hung the padlock on the hasp without clicking it shut. She was not sure why, only that it felt like a different kind of leaving than all the previous ones, not the leaving of a woman who had been given something she didn't understand, but the leaving of a woman who had come to the room she was meant to come to and understood now what it held. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Richard's attorney. One line, "Our client withdraws the challenge." Margaret read it at the kitchen table with her coffee. She folded it along its crease and placed it in the drawer where she had been keeping the documents, the deed, the affidavit, the survey map, the notepad page, the small brass key on its ring. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. Then she picked up her phone and called Daniel Park. She said, "What do we do next?" Daniel Park called on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the withdrawal letter. Margaret was at the kitchen table with her coffee when her phone rang. The same table, the same October light now turned to December, the same blue mug on the counter that she had finally, 2 weeks ago, moved to the cabinet. Not discarded, just placed where it belonged, which was not on the counter, as a monument, but in the cabinet as a mug available present used on the occasional morning when she wanted to feel the particular weight of it in her hand. She had been moving through the house in that way, not clearing, not erasing, just settling things into their right places. It was slow work. It was the right kind of slow. Park said, "Mrs. Vance, I have something for you. Not a problem, a development of a different kind. Are you free this morning?" The offer was on his desk when she arrived, on the letterhead of a commercial development firm based in the city, a company she had not heard of, though Park explained they had been active in the county road corridor for the past 2 years, acquiring parcels, preparing for the commercial development that the corridor's designation had made inevitable. The number was $355,000. Margaret looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Park said the corridor Harold identified 14 years ago is now actively under development. Construction on the road expansion began 4 months ago. The commercial zoning on the Pine Street parcel makes it directly relevant to their project. This is a formal offer, not a preliminary inquiry. He said you have options. You could sell, accept this offer, or negotiate a higher one. You could lease the land and retain ownership while generating income. You could hold and wait for the development to mature further, which might increase the value, but introduces uncertainty. Margaret said, "I need 30 days before I decide." Park said, "Of course." She said, "There's something I need to do first." She drove to Pine Street that afternoon. The garage looked the same from the outside, gray siding, low roof line, the one clouded window on the side wall. The county road beyond it had heavy equipment visible half a mile down. The machinery of the development Harold had seen coming when it was still a dirt road with occasional traffic. She parked and sat for a moment looking at it. Then she got out and unlocked the door and went in. She had been back 3 times since the night of the rain, once to show Ruth, once with Park, to photograph the parcel for the legal file, once alone on a Sunday morning, just to sit in the quiet. But this felt different from those visits. This was a last walk-through, though she had not decided yet whether last meant the sale or only this particular version of what the garage was to her. She moved through it slowly. The pegboard, the labeled jars, the shelves, everything still in Harold's order she had not touched. The arrangement had not felt the right to alter what he had organized so carefully. She ran her fingers along the edge of the fishing hat on its nail by the door. She stood at the shelves and looked at the green thermos she had found here on her first visit, the lost one she had thought gone for years. She went to the workbench. She placed both hands flat on the surface and stood there for a moment with the December light coming through the clouded window and the quiet of a room that had held its purpose for a long time and was about to hold a different one. She said to the room, to the workbench, to whoever might be present in the particular way that people are present in the spaces they have inhabited completely. "You knew about the road corridor, didn't you, Harold? You knew it was coming. You always did." The garage held the sentence without response, which was its own kind of response. She thought about Harold early in their marriage, before Pine Street had meant anything to her, except a cross street she passed on the way to the hardware store. He had handed her a level once she had been helping him with a bookshelf, holding boards while he worked, and he had placed the level on the surface to check it and watch the bubble settle and said, "Everything needs a reference point, Maggie. Something to tell you what's straight and what's tilted. Don't make decisions without one." She had held the board steady and thought it was advice about carpentry. She opened the toolbox. The tools were in their perfect order, socket set. Pliers, screwdrivers, everything Harold had arranged and kept arranged and maintained in the specific placement of a man who believed that the order of tools was a form of respect for the work. She looked at them for a moment. Then she reached into the tray and took out the level. It was small, the kind used for close work, not large spans. 8 inches metal body, the bubble in its glass tube still perfectly centered the way it had been centered when Harold last used it. She held it in her palm and felt its weight, modest, solid, a tool made to tell you what was true. She was not taking a tool. She understood that as she slid it into her coat pocket. She was taking a reference point, something to tell her what was straight and what was tilted, something to carry forward from this room into whatever room came next. She closed the toolbox lid. She stood at the workbench one last time, her hands on the surface, the clean, maintained wood under her palms. She thought about 14 years of Harold coming here on Saturday mornings while she did other things. 14 years of thinking and planning and maintaining and preparing in this room for a future he had seen the shape of, and she had not known to look for. He had looked for both of them. She took her hands from the workbench. She turned off the light. She locked the garage door, clicked the padlock shut this time fully, the final time, and walked to her car. She accepted the offer the following week. She did not call Richard. She called Ruth. Ruth answered on the first ring the way Ruth always answered when she knew something important was in motion. Margaret said, "The offer came through. I'm accepting it." Ruth said, "$355. Margaret said, $355. A pause, then Ruth said quietly, "Worried?" Margaret said, "He always knew what he was doing, Ruth. He saw that road corridor coming from 14 years away. He registered the parcel in my name and filed the affidavit and left the envelope in the toolbox and put the key on my keyring and wrote the note on the refrigerator. He did all of it without telling me a single piece of it, because he knew if he told me I'd say it was too much, that I didn't need it, that we should just leave things as they were." She paused. She said he knew me well enough to know I needed to find it myself. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was very Harold." Margaret said, "Yes, it was." The closing documents were signed on a Wednesday morning in Daniel Park's office. The same table, the same wood-paneled walls, the same courtyard oak through the window now bare in December, its shape more visible without the leaves. She signed each page in the good handwriting Harold had always admired. She signed clearly without hurry. When Park had collected the documents and the transaction was complete, Margaret took the items from her bag, the deed, the notarized affidavit, the survey map, Harold's handwritten note on the lined paper. She placed them together in the new envelope she had brought, cream-colored, the same size as the original. She wrote her name on the front. Her handwriting this time, not Harold's. She placed it in her bag beside the small level in her coat pocket and walked out of Daniel Park's office into the December morning. The developer's check cleared on a Thursday. That weekend, Margaret began looking at houses near the water. Nothing large she did not need large. She needed good windows and a place for the blue mug, and a windowsill where the December light would come in at the right angle, the honest angle, the angle Harold had always called the light that showed you what things actually were. She had a reference point. She knew what she was looking for. 8 months later, Margaret carried the last box through the front door of the cottage near the water. It was a small house, the kind Harold would have called honest in its proportions, nothing performing, nothing pretending to be larger than it was. 1 story, good windows facing east and south, a front porch wide enough for 2 chairs, and a small table, the water visible through the trees, at the edge of the property, in the particular blue-gray of a late summer morning. She had found it in February and taken 3 visits before she made an offer, each time sitting in the car afterward with the level in her coat pocket and asking herself the question Harold had taught her to ask, "Is this straight or does it just look straight?" On the 3rd visit, she had known. She had known because of the light, the honest October light Harold had always named, present here in a different season, but the same quality, the light that showed you what things actually were. And because of the porch, and because of something she could not have explained to anyone who hadn't spent 29 years learning a person's particular way of seeing the feeling of standing in a place that was the right shape for the life she was going to live in it. She had made the offer that afternoon. Her name on the deed, no one else's, no permissions required. She unpacked purposefully the way she did everything that mattered, not quickly, but with full attention, each object placed where it belonged, rather than where it was convenient. She had less than she might have had. She had brought what was genuinely hers, the books she had chosen, the kitchen things she had used, the photographs from the years she wanted to keep close. She had not taken things to fill space. She had taken things because they were true. The blue mug went in the cabinet above the coffee maker on the left side, where the morning light would find it. She unpacked the framed documents last. She had framed them herself in a double frame. She had chosen carefully the deed on the left, the notarized affidavit on the right side, by side behind glass Harold's signature, visible on both. She had not done it immediately after the sale. She had waited until she had a wall that was right for them, in a house that was right for what they meant. She hung them beside the front door. The deed to the Pine Street parcel and the affidavit of independent registration, 14 years of Harold's preparation, visible now framed in the entryway of the house that preparation had made possible. Every person who walked through her door would pass them. She would see them every morning on the way out and every evening on the way in, and they would mean what they meant. Not a legal victory, not a record of a dispute, but the physical evidence of a man who had loved her, with the specific practical forward-looking love of someone who understood that love without preparation is intention without architecture. She stood back and looked at them. Then she took the level from her coat pocket. She had been carrying it since the day she took it from Harold's toolbox, through the closing, through the months of searching, through the moving and the unpacking. It had been in every coat she'd worn, transferred from pocket to pocket, the small weight of it present in the way that certain objects become present when they are carrying something beyond their physical purpose. She found the nail she had placed in the kitchen wall for this specific purpose. She had measured for it before the movers came, had stood in the empty kitchen with a tape measure, and thought about where Harold would have put it if this had been his wall, and had put it there. She hung the level on the nail. She stepped back and looked at it. Then, almost without deciding to, she reached out and checked it, touched it lightly, let it settle, watched the bubble find its position. It centered exactly. "Of course it does," she said to the kitchen, to the morning light, to no one in particular. She smiled. It was the first time in 8 months that she had smiled, the way she meant it, not the managed smile of a woman performing recovery for other people's comfort, but the real kind, the kind that arrives before you have decided to smile, surprised out of you by something that is exactly what it should be. Ruth came that afternoon with the last 2 boxes from storage and a bag of groceries that contained the specific items she had decided Margaret would need on her first evening in a new house: good coffee bread, something for dinner that required no complicated effort, and a small plant for the kitchen windowsill because Ruth had strong views about plants in kitchens. They unpacked the remaining boxes together, moving through the rooms with the easy efficiency of 2 women who have known each other long enough that the work doesn't require coordination, each finding what needed doing and doing it the kind of collaboration that accumulates over decades of friendship. When the boxes were empty and broken down and the cottage had the quality of a place where someone actually lived, they took their coffee to the front porch. 2 chairs, a small table between them. The afternoon light in the trees, the water visible through the gaps, the particular stillness of a late summer afternoon that has decided not to hurry toward evening. They sat for a long time without speaking, which was one of the things Margaret had always valued most about Ruth. The understanding that silence between people who trust each other is not a deficit, but a form of presence. Then Ruth said, "Tell me about him." Margaret held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the water through the trees. She said, "He drove past this cottage once. Years ago. We were on a Sunday drive. He took Sunday drives sometimes just to look at things without a destination. We came down this road and he slowed down without explaining why the way he did when something caught his attention. He looked at the cottage and he said, 'That one, Maggie. That's where things slow down, right?'" She paused. She said I didn't ask what he meant. I trusted the sentence. Ruth said you always did. Margaret said he also said that same drive, or maybe a different one, they blur together now. He said a woman should have a door that's only hers, Maggie. I've been working on that. She looked at the framed documents visible through the front door glass from the porch, the deed, the affidavit, side by side, Harold's signature on both. She said he finished what he started. Harold had not been thinking about money when he registered the Pine Street parcel in her name 14 years before his death. She understood that completely now, in the way you understand things that have been true all along, but required a specific accumulation of evidence before they became visible. He had been thinking about a door. He had watched his children for 20 years and loved them with the complicated, clear-eyed love of a parent who knows his children and has made his peace with what he knows. And he had understood that when he was gone, Margaret would be left in a room full of people who would treat her loss as an administrative matter and her grief as a scheduling inconvenience. He had known that Richard would count what he had, and that Carol would offer the particular condescension of pity. He had known all of it the way he knew the shape of a corridor before it was built, the way he knew the future of land before the future had confirmed it. And he had built her a way out of that room that no one could lock, not wealth for its own sake. A door, a deed in her name alone, a house near the water where things slowed down, right made possible by a garage on a county road that a man with a carpenter's eye had understood was going to matter. Every house needs a good foundation, Maggie, and every foundation starts with knowing what's level and what's not. She looked at the water through the trees and thought about the level on the kitchen wall, and the bubble settled exactly in the center. She thought about Harold's hands on a workbench, on a keyring, on a refrigerator notepad at 2 a.m, on a piece of lined paper with one sentence that had been waiting in a padlocked toolbox in a clean, maintained garage for her to find. She thought about all the quiet work of love that does not announce itself. The porch was warm in the late afternoon light. Ruth's coffee cup sat beside hers on the small table between the two chairs. The water was still through the trees, that particular blue-gray still, and the cottage behind them had its lamp on in the kitchen where the level hung on the wall and the framed documents waited by the front door. Everything was what Harold had said it would be. Everything was level. She sat on the porch with her coffee and did not need to say anything further because some things are complete in the way that well-built things are complete, not flashy, not complicated, just true to what they were meant to be and lasting exactly as long as they needed to last. Harold had known. He had always known, and the knowing had been the love.